Hello and welcome to this special panel discussion focused on cybersecurity in the age of pandemic. As we understand, the ongoing pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation agenda of government organization. This continued push on technology has enabled effective public service delivery while the country was going through lockdown. But the challenge is that the same technology platforms are also being exploited by cybercriminals to attack the critical IT infrastructure. This challenge is further compounded by the fact that these bad actors are now also advancing their toolkits by adding artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities. This necessitates public sector technology leaders to bolster their strategies and cybersecurity's capabilities. To understand how public sector leaders are mitigating this new emerging challenge, we are joined by, for this panel discussion, Lieutenant General Dr. Rajesh Pant, National Cybersecurity Coordinator in Prime Minister Office, Mr. Suresh Sethi, Managing Director and CEO, NSDL eGovernance Infrastructure Limited, Mr. Amit Sharma, Director and Advisor, Cybersecurity with Union Ministry of Defense, Mr. Jatin Gambhir, Country Business Head, Akamai Technology, and Mr. Samani, McAfee Fellow and Chief Scientist with cybersecurity giant McAfee. Before beginning this panel discussion, I would like to request Dr. Pant to deliver his keynote address. Dr. Pant, over to you.
Thank you so much, and greetings of the day to all the fellow panelists as well as all the attendees of this very unique event organized by the Economic Times on cybersecurity in the age of the pandemic. You have asked me to speak on a very unique subject. It sounds simple, but it has actually the essence of the entire subject. And the topic you have given to me is making sense of cybersecurity. So let me start with the way we see the world around us in the different dimensions of land, air, sea, space, and cyber. And in all these dimensions, there are boundaries, there are rules, and there are regulations, except for the domain of cyber, which is borderless, and where even from the rules point of view, since we have recently been going through the United Nations group of government experts process, etc., it has taken almost 15 years to come out with 11 non-binding norms for responsible behavior by states on the internet. So this is the unique dimension. And in all the other dimensions also, the bad and the evil players are there, whether it is land, sea, and just yesterday itself, you heard the Prime Minister speaking on maritime security and talking of piracy at sea. Similarly, there is, piracy and theft and fraudsters in the cyber domain. So, what is cyberspace? Basically, it is the interconnected world of information technology, of operational technology, and of the Internet of Things, including the networks, including the data centers, etc. So this is what cyberspace is all about, and how do we protect it? So the concept of security is the same, whether it is physical security or other security. In physical security also, you've seen that the VIPs have an additional layer of security, right? Because the quotation is that if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. So we have to carry out a risk assessment, identify what are our critical assets, and then protect them with something more than the others. I'm not saying that the others need not be protected, but the critical assets need to be protected with something more than the others. And what does it involve? What is the span and the spectrum of cybersecurity? It starts with the human mind. Firstly, there has to be a sense of security in that person himself. And it is actually, there's a technical name for it. It's called the Newman's eighth layer. So basically, it is your sense of cyber hygiene as to how seriously do you take security. Because if you don't have a sense of security, and if I do the other processes and the people and the technology part, then it won't make a difference. So it's very important in cybersecurity especially that you have a sense of cyber hygiene. Then it starts off from the device that you're using, which is generally called as the endpoint. Whether it is the mobile, whether it is your laptop or your PC, what is the device you're using, what are the applications in that device, what is the operating system of that device. So there's a series of attack vectors, as they are called, or risks that are associated with the endpoint. Then we come to the network. How is your device connected to the network? That is through your home router, your wireless access point, your distribution unit inside the building where you're staying, then the ISP network. So the entire network security is also a part of cyber security. And this involves a large amount of variety of devices, etc. And in case you're using a VPN, then there's something else. In case cloud services are being used, then the cloud security also is a very important aspect today. And then, of course, is how the service provider is protecting his own enterprise. So the entire enterprise security aspects of your firewall, IDS, IPS, behavior analytics, etc. All that also forms part of the cyber security. Then we come to the data. After all, data security, whether data is at rest or it is in transit or it is in storage or it is under processing, data security is very much a part of cyber security, because that is what has value. And if you see the what has happened around the world, the general data protection regulations in Europe and the various cyber acts which have been enunciated in the US, and the personal data protection bill that is being currently discussed in the Indian Parliament, everything is all about protecting data, because it is data that has value. And people call it oil, some say water. The other day I was in a seminar where they said it is actually a treasure. It is only when you open the box that you come to know the value of data. So data security is again very important. And then we have this latest issue of supply chain security. And some of you must have heard of the famous SolarWinds case that took place in the US, as to how the supply chain infection took place in the software updates. And they had 18,000 clients which got affected because of the updates. So whether it is the software supply chain or the hardware supply chain, about which we have been talking for a number of years, as to why should we be so careful about where the chips are coming from, what is the fab, who has designed the chip, and where are the microcontrollers, etc., coming from, the programmable active components. So that is another aspect of the spectrum of cyber security. And finally, we come to the physical security of your IT assets. So this is the expanse and the spectrum of cyber security. So what does it involve? It involves various actions. There are some actions that take place before a cyber incident takes place, and there are some actions during a cyber incident, and some actions after a cyber incident. So before a cyber incident is basically your information security, education, and awareness, which is most important. And the government of India has a massive program for that under McAfee, where CDAC is implementing this. We have various other foundations like the Cyber Peace Foundations, etc., various other universities and educational institutions which are carrying out this part of the cyber hygiene and the information security, education, and awareness. Then, in order to prevent the incident taking place, there is the concept of cyber audit, which is again very important, that a CERT impaneled auditor, CERT, as you know, is your computer emergency response team. They impanel a number of auditors, both for the IT part as well as the OT part, and they have to carry out an audit. So there is a concept of vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And then there are these exercises. You have the red teaming exercises. So you carry out all the actions which are there in the cyber crisis management plan and ensure that when a crisis occurs, you are prepared for it. So all these actions take place before the incident, the training part, the education part, the exercises part, the audit part. During an incident, you have to ensure that the damage is minimized. So you have to have a standard operating procedure as to how you will report the incident. In India, we have the computer emergency response team, which is there for incident response. And how will you ensure that the loss is the minimum? So there is a concept today of network segmentation. Even within the virtual machines also, the segmentation is done so that the damage is confined to a small area. And then, of course, after the incident, there is the aspect of remediation. How do you sequester the network? How do you carry out the digital forensics? That is again a very important aspect as to how, without disturbing the actual data, you make an image of it and then carry out analysis on that image. And there are various techniques of digital forensics. and finally your recovery aspects and the reporting aspects. So this is the chain of action. So this is what basically cybersecurity is all about. It's a huge cyberspace. The other day, someone was saying that the Internet of Things devices are going to be 75 billion by 2025. And the main reason for that is the 5G, the fifth generation of the mobile telecom services, as you're aware, will involve Industry 4.0. It will involve your, passenger driverless vehicles. It will involve a large number of variety of IoT devices. So there's going to be an absolute explosion. And this is going to exponentially increase the surface. So in the future, this subject is going to become more and more important. And that is why I'm glad that an organization like yours has organized this discussion and highlighted the importance of this. So this is what is the, as you asked me, the making sense of cybersecurity. So with that, let me take a rest now, because I can see in your panel experts, I also want to learn something today. So it's back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your brief remarks and keynote address. I'll just pick it from what you have spoken, and then I'll move to our panelists. What we understand that, as earlier I said, that during the pandemic, the digital transformation programs for both public sector organization as well as enterprises, because this was the only platform on which they could rely, and so the digital transformation agenda actually accelerated, and that also created large vector surface for cyber attacks. And we also read a couple of news story that the cyber attack cases during the pandemic has increased. So I know the government of India is working on a proper strategy, cyber security strategy to be put in place. What has been your analysis of cyber security trends during pandemic?
So now coming specifically to the pandemic, it has actually, what they say is, flipped this cybersecurity architecture on its head. And the reason that you yourself said is, when the lockdown took place, everything became tele. The word tele means from a distance. So whether it was teleworking, whether it was tele-education, tele-health, governance was all on the e-governance mode. Your financial transactions went up because you were forced only to rely on that. So there was an increase, a sudden increase, mind you. And this is what is called as the DX, the digital transformation that you mentioned. And the sudden increase was the perfect storm for the fraudsters to come in, because they are just waiting for this unstable sort of a environment in which there is a fear, there is anxiety, and people are wanting to know, what about the vaccine? Where do I go in case I get COVID? So a lot of these clickbaiting or the phishing emails started coming in, due to which the malware spread. And then, there were a large number of cases of individuals losing money, of business email compromises, of data being stolen, especially the personal identifiable information. So this is what the pandemic created. So the government had to step in immediately. And one of the first things that happened was that cybersecurity became an essential service. So when the National Disaster Management Act was invoked in the month of March last year, there are a few services, like police, medical, etc., that are classified in that NDMA as essential services, and only they are allowed certain privileges. But when this online thefts and crime went up, so we immediately approached the Ministry of Home Affairs, and they came out with a direction that cybersecurity services will also be included as an essential service. So that was the first impact of the pandemic. The second impact, I mentioned that the architecture flipped on its head, because earlier there was a fort and a moat concept of protecting enterprises. So you had a nice firewall that I mentioned earlier, behind which everyone worked. And then we had, your intrusion detection system, the intrusion prevention system. There was a nice security operations center, incident and event management, SIEM, and behavior analytics, etc. But now with people working from home, how do I ensure that that person is the one that works for my enterprise? and the application that he's using is a genuine application. So two things happened. One, identity and access management suddenly became very important.
Right.
Second was there was a concept of the zero trust architecture that had to be implemented. So ensuring the identity of the person, ensuring that the device and the application that he's using is what is required for that particular length of time for which the application is required, including the entire chain that I mentioned. Now that chain of the ISP also became important.
Right.
So the entire architecture of cybersecurity changed. So this was the second impact, and I'm telling you, the private sector and of course the public sector, the way they responded and the number of solutions that came out surprised even me. That certainly, you know, this identity and access management, they came out with a large number of solutions as well as the zero trust architecture, etc. Right. So there are some other things like, you know, ransomware and all that also happened. But for the moment, this was the major impact. But now things have settled down. People have got used to it, and a lot of cyber hygiene and awareness has come.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll come back to you again. Before I move to Mr. Amit Sharma, I'll go to Mr. Suresh Sethi. Mr. Sethi, your organization works at the cutting edge of e-governance services, especially NSDN. How has been your experience during the pandemic? Because there are a lot of services that your organization provide, which falls somewhere in and around e-governance, and which is really needed by people across the country, not only in urban areas, but also in the rural areas. So what have been your experience in terms of managing your platform from a cybersecurity perspective? What kind of trend did you notice?
So I think as Dr. Pant already called out, he covered it very comprehensively. Some of the areas I would like to reflect on is that, especially during the pandemic, while we have been working on providing e-governance services and trying to bring digital and last mile services into the hands of the consumer and make it universally aware, the dependence on digital and remote became even more enhanced. So whether we see our own platforms, because today we are contributing in terms of tax-related infrastructure, where you're providing last mile services for filing of taxes, for applying for PAN card services. We similarly today enable the BFSI sector by providing them the identity layer aspect of the Aadhaar stack. And we provide them services in the area of eKYC, e-authentication, e-sign services. All these services today have become end-to-end journeys in which people are adopting digital more and more. And even from a government perspective, we are seeing that going forward, a digital first and a mobile first experience is becoming more and more important. Even if we look at our significant applications, right, starting from CoWIN to DigiLocker to Umang to M-Parivahan, all these applications today are providing citizen-centric services, and they are all dependent on either a mobile-first approach or a web-based approach. So it has become very critical to us to look at the security layers in which these applications are being provided and made available to the consumers. So I think a couple of things become very relevant over here. Data and data security becomes very critical because in all these cases, somewhere I'm consuming data or sharing my information in a public ecosystem. And that is where we have to put the maximum practices in place to ensure that that information is securely captured. The other thing which we saw during the pandemic clearly was people working remotely. So access point security became very critical, whether it was at the device level or whether it was from an identity perspective. Those two factors become again very critical. Now, enablers like Aadhaar today give you a very simple way of identifying yourself, and even people who are not very savvy with consumption of technology and digital can simply use their fingerprint and get signed into a particular transaction or authorize a transaction using that. But at the same time, identity for consumption becomes a critical factor, and things like multi-factor authentication, including provision of providing endpoint detection and response and extended detection and response. These are critical factors which we have been adopting and implementing at the last mile to make sure that the journeys are secure and cyberly secured.
Mr. Sharma, I'll come to you. How has been your experience in Ministry of Defense? Because the use cases of cybersecurity and kind of challenge different organizations face is slightly different because you are actually working with a different data set. So how has been your experience from Ministry of Defense perspective?
looking into the larger perspective, specifically in pandemic, it blurred a lot of boundaries. As General Pant rightly said so, typically the organizations and the way in which the organizational cybersecurity culture works around is very different if you look into defense, if you look into probably in private sector or probably into other entities. It's very much endemic to an organization. So the classical way in which the fortifications were done, unfortunately, the pandemic changed the landscape altogether. Now you were looking into much larger inclusion of people working on internet, video conferences that are happening, people working on exchanges all onto the digital platforms. Now, as these particular way regime has evolved, so the scenarios have, in order to secure these assets, also evolved. And one of the very key aspect, as been brought out by the earlier speaker also, the key emphasis for us was hardening the endpoints and to have much larger control onto the access points, because these are the two entities. Now you are looking into a larger surface area, the larger attack surface that you have to protect. And if you are looking into this larger attack surface, you need to change your methodologies to unconventional ones. One of the key aspects that were looked into was protection and extending this protection to the endpoints right at the individual endpoints, even beyond office. So that was something that was typically not utilized in the classical way in which sensitive organizations do approach things. Another important aspect was to introduce multiple tiers of security layer and imbibe in them in that a zero trust architecture. The zero trust architecture results into much better granularity in terms of controlling and at the same time enabling the services at a much larger extent. And these were some of the major factors that were contributed upon. Other aspects in terms of fortification, in terms of identification, much larger emphasis was paid onto the platforms such as your email services that are there. Endpoint detection scenarios, looking into whether there is any spear phishing campaign or whether there is malware or payloads that are embedded as part of the email. So a larger focus was paid specifically to look into and to sanitize whatever the end user is getting, apart from ensuring that the end users themselves are pretty hardened, so that even if the attack surface has increased, the attack surface to some extent is decreased by that hardening aspect. And then ensuring multiple tiers of authentications in terms of stronger VPNs, encryption layers that have been introduced, which ensure that the confidentiality as well as integrity is maintained, apart from not hampering the user experience as well as working out in the digital space.
Absolutely. Before I come to you, Mr. Samani, I'll go to Mr. Jatin Gambhir. Mr. Gambhir, couple of things is very much clear that endpoint is really becoming quite critical during the pandemic. And what we have observed also during the pandemic, that cyber attacks have grown in both scale and complexity, with higher number of attacks being, multi-vector attacks. Uh, what really it's required is basically this calls for a shift in paradigm as to how we view and architect our security postures. So I would like to understand from you, how do you look on a new architecture point of view? What is your thought process on that?
So I think all the fellow panelists and of course what General Pant said, it just kind of gives a such a great overview of the entire, not just the problem statement, but how to view the entire thing. And also, what Mr. Amit Sharma just mentioned about the user experience. I think all of these go hand in hand, right? I think both as a consumer and enabler of technology, even as citizens, right? During the entire pandemic, our schools went online, our healthcare went online, banking went online, and it was just so heartening to see the both financial and digital inclusion, which kept the machinery running, right? Not just that on the financial, on the citizen services, but even at a corporate level, internet became the new corporate network. right? There was the definition of a perimeter was just diminished. You were now working from home, you were studying at home, you were doing healthcare at home, and everything was being enabled by internet. Now, as General Pant mentioned, wherever there is data, there is treasure, there will be areas to things to protect around that as well. So I think a couple of fundamental things which we see. One, security has moved away from being a tick box requirement or regulatory thing to a strategy, right? It's no longer of saying, okay, I am secure. It's about how are we looking at a fundamental shift in that. Now, what we mean by that is that, again, to what Mr. Amit Sharma said, the first and foremost part is how do we reduce the attack surface itself, right? And a simple example of that would be that in a zero trust architecture, which all our panelists are referring to, a fundamental thing is that how do we move away from a network-based access to more an application-level access, so that irrespective of a device having been exposed or anything like that, at an application level, things are still in control. To give you an example, I might be accessing my bank account on my mobile. Now, even if my mobile is infected, my bank doesn't care because it's an application level. However, if I am at a VPN level or if I'm at a network level with an infected device, I can get it, right? So it is a very paradigm shift, which we've seen, which has moved away from a network layer to an application layer where things have moved in. The other important aspect which coming out of this entire thing is that we are talking about a very important balance between a secure posture and a user experience, because especially in citizen services, the adoption is directly correlated to what's the experience which they're getting, right? If you don't give them experience, then the adoption will be low as well. So we have to be very careful as to how every layer of security which is being added will somewhere compromise on the user experience as well. So it's rather than a lot of heterogeneous solutions coming together or continue to bring in a product to a problem, it just eventually creates a heterogeneous environment, which also becomes multiple points of failure, right? So I think it's time where both public sector and large enterprises are looking at moving from just a product-based approach or a point solution based to a heterogeneous platform. That how does it become an integrated part of your organization and the solution which you're trying to offer either to the citizens or to your end customers.
Right. Mr. Samani, just adding to what Mr. Jatin said, we also notice one thing now: the data center for most of the organization is becoming highly heterogeneous. I mean, you are in a multi-cloud environment where some sort of data is on-prem and something is in the cloud. And even if you move from network perimeter to your application, and if you do segmentation, there is a lot of heterogeneity. And there is no easy conversation happening in between. And then you have now cyber attackers with the capabilities of AI and machine learning. That means they can multiply things quite easily. In such a situation, how do you look at solving this complex situation from an architecture posture point of view?
Let me try to answer that question in a different way. We need to acknowledge that India, and certainly the digital infrastructure of India, is one of the most targeted nations on the planet. Now, the discussion of this panel is related to the pandemic. And of course, over the past 18 months, we with our global telemetry, we track the number of malicious emails that have been sent using COVID as a lure. India was number 6 across the entire globe. It had 10 times more malicious attempts to infect Indian citizens than China, over double that of Germany. So, our fascination with different architectures, we've got to recognize that it doesn't matter whether you're in the cloud, whether you're out of the cloud, whether you're under the cloud. At the end of the day, regardless of the architecture you use, cybersecurity has to act as the foundation, regardless of whether you're using zero trust, regardless of whether you're on-prem, regardless of whether you're outsourcing. And in many times, we get so focused on different technologies or different buzzwords, but the foundation of the society or the digital society of India, and actually all countries across the globe, is dependent upon good, strong cybersecurity and privacy practices. So I kind of recognize I'm not quite answering your question the way that you want, but look, it doesn't matter where you put your data. bad guys will go and target you, and they will continue to target you. And if there's anything that I've seen over the last 18 months, they're getting better, they're getting quicker, and they're finding different ways to disrupt. We've talked about endpoints. We haven't talked about misinformation related to the pandemic, which has resulted in huge swathes of people not getting vaccinated. I mean, that is a cybersecurity consideration, but it's not considered like that. So it's a bigger question, I think, or certainly a bigger answer than perhaps what I've kind of touched on.
Dr. Pant, I'll come to you now. A couple of things that our speakers have said, which is around endpoint, mitigating challenge during the pandemic, and some of the cyber attackers actually increasing their capabilities with the AI and machine learning and all. But what we understand in India, that we do have some of the largest platform globally in terms of the Aadhaar, GST, UPI and all. And those platforms have not been touched. I mean, those platforms are safe and secure, and we have not come across something so fatal and so drastically bad. Okay, there might be some cases here and there in some state, in some government department. So that for sure that we do have what Mr. Samani was saying. If your foundation is clear, and whether you are in cloud or on-prem, wherever you are, if the foundation is perfect, possibly you will be able to mitigate any kind of challenge quite well. In that light, I would like to understand from you what new method you're observing in terms of the mitigating challenge within public sector organization, because within public sector capacity and of different organization is different. I mean, organization like yours will have the more power, more resources to do, and possibly one small government organization, a corporation might not have. So how do you look at that?
Firstly, let me dispel this aspect of the public part. Because cybersecurity and securing national cyberspace, it's a whole of a nation approach. Because in the critical sector, you take power, you take telecom, most of them are private companies. So it is very important. And what we always keep saying is that there is a common but differentiated responsibility. The individual has a responsibility, the businesses have a responsibility, and the government has a responsibility. But they have a common but differentiated responsibility towards ensuring that the overall national cyberspace remains protected. Now, having said that, let me also share the good news, which you must have heard about 3-4 weeks back, that in the Global Cybersecurity Index, which is a United Nations index, it is not some think tank index, we were till last year number 47. And the latest one that has been announced, that from 47 we have come to number 10. So we have jumped up 37 places. And it's not that this has happened by chance. It was a year-long process which my office was very deeply involved in, as to how do we answer all the 153 questions regarding what are the legal processes that we have, what are the technological processes that we have, what is the collaborative mechanism that we have within the country for threat sharing, etc. What is the cooperation we have with the other certs, etc. So it's a very detailed process. But having said that, you see, from our 2013 policy onwards, we have been able to create a number of institutions, including one for threat prediction, which is called the National Cyber Coordination Center, that is at the apex level, which monitors the metadata and then, warns if there's a DDoS attack or something building up, some IP, etc. Then for the critical sector, we created a separate organization, a National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center. Then Mr. Amit Sharma setup is also there in the Defense Research and Development Organization for cybercrime, which is something you can say is a separate entity under the Ministry of Home Affairs. We created an organization like I4C, the Indian Cybercrime Coordination Center, which, just for your information, is accessed through the cybercrime.gov.in. That is where you report the cybercrime incidents. And there it is linked to all the cybercrime cells in the districts of India. So in the last couple of years, a lot of major initiatives have taken place. Or as I said, it's a whole of a nation approach. And then even the Ministry of External Affairs has got a cyber diplomacy division. The CERT India has also expanded and started these projects like the botnet cleaning center. You must have heard of the cyber swachhta Kendra, etc. And then, of course, finally, my establishment, which has come up over the last few years. And finally, in December last year, the government approved the National Security Directive on the telecom sector. That was to cater for the supply chain that I mentioned earlier, which is getting more and more serious, both the software supply chain as well as the hardware supply chain. So at least in the telecom sector, amongst all the critical sectors, two sectors are considered as supercritical. That is power and telecom. If something happens to power, then this, whatever tete-a-tete we are having will go off. And if something happens to telecom, then there'll be a similar situation. So for the telecom sector, the cabinet approved this directive, and from 15th of June this year, any product that is going to be connected to the national telecom network has to be a trusted product from a trusted source. And there is a methodology behind it. And we are the only nation in the world to be undertaking this exercise. All the other nations have come out with a negative list that they won't have X company, Y company, will not do business in their country. We have said no. We are not naming any company, but who can come in is the one that follows these principles, etc. So these are some of the major actions that have taken place. Let me also say that the states have done a brilliant job. Various centers of excellence have opened up. The various sectors have done an excellent job. The other day I went to the power sector SOC. They've got a separate SOC for transmission, generation, distribution, and grid operations. So telecom sector has got a T-cert, financial sector has started a FinCert. So at a national level, all these initiatives have now just come together, and you said nothing has happened to UIDI, but while you were talking, my fingers were crossed. So because, there is a quotation that every day is a D-Day in cyberspace. So right. I think I've said enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll go to Mr. Sethi. Mr. Sethi, what Dr. Pant was saying that that there are smaller SOC and NOC are being set up across the country by different organizations, and what they are doing, actually they are creating some level of data gathering and some level of prediction so that the cyber attack or something unwanted could be mitigated. This is one of the best way of actually thwarting any kind of cyber attack. Would you like to share, based on the fact that the perimeter for organization are blurring and we have a different kind of attacks happening during the pandemic, what best practices we can follow based on your organization understanding of it?
So I think the simplest, which some of the panelists earlier mentioned, I think the main thing is first about cyber sense was the word which Dr. Pant used. And I think cyber awareness and cyber, overall understanding within the organization has to be critical, because that becomes the first measure in which you can start working towards it. The second area critically, and I think Jatin spoke about that we have both internal and external customers. Now today, the more we layer up with, and I have a banking background, so the more we layer up from an experience perspective with single factor, two factor, multi-factor security, the more difficult it becomes possible to use that particular capability or platform or channel. And what becomes very critical is that you have to have some risk-adjusted ways in which you can integrate with the customers. And today, as I was giving you the example earlier of things like Aadhaar, when we've gone to consumers today, whether they are practices in terms of office attendance, people who are allowed physical access to premises, people who can do transactions, get access to their applications, the more simpler the ways you create over there, the better it becomes for that. The other thing critically, which we are adopting as a practice, because today when you're looking at the number of scenarios which get created out there, and I do understand the reference you gave that most of the threat actors today are adopting machine learning and artificial intelligence. Likewise, it is important for us to make that as a very integral part of our data gathering, of our ability to look at the data and learn from it, and then use artificial intelligence parameters to make sure that any anomalies, any any sort of missteps are carefully calibrated and we are able to build threat scenarios and address them proactively. So I think these are a few things which become very critical, but starting from the basics of cyber awareness and cyber security, that becomes critical.
Right, absolutely. Mrs. Sharma, what Mrs. Sethi is saying, cyber awareness is really important. And what earlier Mr. Samani was also saying that you need to have a kind of digital foundation where the security, cyber security should be embedded. It should be an integral part of your beginning. But what we understand in public sector organization, and even generally, there is lot of cyber security skill gaps. I mean, we do not have the kind of data scientists. I mean, not everybody is Rasavani. I mean, chief scientist. Okay, so there is lot of skill gap actually, even for the artificial intelligence, the emerging technologies applications, and also for the cyber security domain, because a lot of things are happening. So how do we address this skill gap challenge? I know there are a lot of collaboration happening between government organization and private organization. A lot of things has been put in place, as Dr. Rajesh Pant said. But how do we address so that down the line in 5 year or 3 year, we should have number of people within our government ecosystem on which we can rely?
It's an important aspect, the cyber awareness aspect. That's one part of it. And the second is the skilling aspects of the protectors. The guys who are defending, they need to be skilled specifically to handle the challenges in the same way the attackers are proliferating and improvising. But having said so, the first thing that I would like to comment on is that it's not the fact that, yes, in the pandemic, a lot of attacks were seen. Definitely, in terms of apps, multiple spurious apps were created out. There were multiple levels of spear phishing attacks, and even the common public, in terms of, for example, like one of the things that Dr. Samani referred to, that multiple such apps, counterfeit apps, they were there. But having said so, cyberspace, I always perceive, unlike the conventional domain, it's more of evolving space. It's more of an active space. So, for example, yes, the threat vectors were there, but at the same times, those threat vectors were neutralized. Yes, there were a lot of attacks, but primarily because of the fact that the digital space, if you look in India, it's phenomenally high. It's phenomenally high, and especially with the disruptions in mobile technologies, everyone is in cyberspace in one way or another. So we have a lot of attack surface that is there. Having said so, each time an attack happens, there is a counteract to it. These attacks, we always hear about how these attacks happen, but many times we do not hear about the fact that most of these attacks were neutralized, because at the end of it, it's not just about the risk, it's also about the impact. It is the impact that these attacks happen. Many times there would be an attack, but whether that attack actually culminated into something that resulted into an attack, in impact, that is something that we need to realize. Addressing to your primary question, I would take that question in two important aspects. One is the journal cyber awareness. The journal cyber awareness is because cybersecurity now, it's not just limited to, let's say, the defenders itself. It has to be extended to everyone. So that is in order to know about the journal cyber hygiene, in order to look into how exactly you need to conduct, how exactly, the fortifications, because right now the fortifications are not there. There is a lot of blurringness that has happened. So each one of us has to be looked into, and that is where General Pant very aptly said so, that multiple programs in terms of awareness, in terms of user awareness component has been taken up by various ministries ab initio, and especially, I would not use the word skilling here, but especially making the people aware that yes, they are under threat. What is the new attack surface that has been taken up? The second important aspect is the skill set. The skill set, and that is where we come to the niche part when we are looking into the skilling the defenders, the guys who are supposed to take care of the security of the overall establishment. I would say it with a fair amount of confidence that nowadays a lot of initiatives have happened into the government of India. You'll see a lot of officers that are who are dealing with these operated mandates. They are being spilled on very specialized. I always remember probably 5 years or 6 years or 7 years from now, people used to say, MTech cybersecurity or BTech cybersecurity, do some course or something like that. But now people are not talking like that. People are talking about advanced certifications, advanced courses. Very few people, because in industry, it's a very common lingo, OSCP, or probably a CEH. There are multiple certifications that are there, primarily onto the application oriented. But you'll be amazed the quantum number of officers who are dealing with these mandated roles. They are going into more practical aspects into it. Adding to it, each of the ministries and the centralized space, which is actually providing out most of these solutions, they have certain specialists that are being part of the government. The government, typically the way in which people see it, that just the government officers or
Right.
a government guy on a government payroll has been working out to protect it. It's gone beyond that. You have
Right.
active inclusion of academia, and most importantly, industry is extensively ingrained into the government, and that
Right.
is where the skilling aspects has moved from the classical domain of the college oriented or university oriented skilling set to advanced courses. To give you
Right.
small example, for example, MOD itself, there were two online courses that were certifications. One was the DIIT. DIIT is the Defense Institute of Advanced Studies. DIIT
Right.
Certified Information Assurance Professional. And the key point is information assurance. It's a change in the way in which we are looking at things. Similarly, DIIT certified uh, artificial intelligence. These are certain things that are there, but that's not. I'm just giving you one of example. Each of the IITs, each of the prestigious institutions within the government and outside the government have been looking specifically to enhance skills and specifically into the niche areas of data analytics, behavioral analytics, identification of threat mitigation, malware analysis, reverse engineering aspects, and looking into the next generation SecDevOps. When you are looking into Kubernetes and aspects that are specifically very much containerization, sandboxing, these the next generation technologies. Now you are talking about these technologies being used hand in hand specifically, and I would really put emphasis on what Jatin referred to. You know, moving the security to the application domain and ensuring that everything is in a containerized mode, so that even if something goes wrong, because take my word for it, there is nothing like 100% security.
Right.
There would be always one smart guy who will try to break into something that you would have conceived, and
Right.
that's we say it's a improvisation and disruption in
Right.
cyberspace. But
Absolutely.
you put more and more controls, harming the user experience. That's the
Right.
key aspect.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. There is no silver bullet in cybersecurity. Mr. Jatin, Gambhir, would you like to add your views on as to how create the right set of skill resources within government organization, and possibly your organization and McAfee being organization having a lot of expertise within themselves, and how you people are actually enabling government organization?
Absolutely. I think a lot of things which all the fellow panelists said, and I completely agree with Mr. Amit Sharma also. See, I think cybersecurity is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And going forward, it's a question of ongoing basis, right? So it's not that it will not happen. It will continue to happen. It's a matter of how you're responding to it more and more. The other important aspect is that the entire way the threat landscape is, it's evolving. Today, half the traffic on internet is not even human. It's bots, APIs are there, right? Credential abuse is on the rise. We saw almost like close to 200 billion attacks on our platform last year, which is like a massive increase. It was not a problem 5 years back. Over the last 3 to 5 years, this problem has come up. Next 5 years, the landscape will change again, right? Ransomware phishing has a massive rise because of this. So when we're looking at building our skill set, and every organization is now technology enabled. So every organization is a technology thing. So you have to, if you're deploying, resources, it is alongside all the other core functions which you're doing, and cybersecurity as an ongoing thing, right? So you'll always have to do a load balance of saying how much can you deploy and how can you continue to keep up with the changing landscape as well, right? So I think, yes, and with Dr. Pant said, couldn't agree more. I think it's always a shared responsibility. First and foremost, you're as intelligent as the amount of data you have to take the intelligent decisions. Second, when you're taking those decisions, how are you responding and keeping yourself up to date with it? How are you building certain skills in-house to ensure that you have control over different layers? Like, as again, Dr. Pant said, there'll be some very critical, some medium, some low, but you'll have to keep a strategy around it. So what are we doing in-house? How are you partnering with the right organization, with the industry, to bring in the right amount of information, the right amount of skill set on an ongoing basis? And I think I was reading a report recently that given the rate at which we're going, I think we need 1 million plus cybersecurity professional. It's not about 1 million people doing a certification or 1 million people going through a degree. It's about keeping those 1 million people updated on an ongoing basis and ensuring that they're able to come and imply the knowledge when it's required the most, right? Which is where it is people, your process, and your right partnerships, right? All of three have to come together to create an ecosystem in which security is kind of well managed on an ongoing basis.
Mr. Samani, would you like to add your views on as to how government organization can create right set of skill base within government organization for mitigating the cybersecurity challenge and possibly deploying the high end of cybersecurity solutions?
First of all, I don't think there's a skills problem. I think there's a lack of courage problem. Many organizations today will go out and ask for people with a CISSP or a certificate here and there, and then turn around and say, well, actually, we only want to pay you 20, 30,000 per annum, right? That's ridiculous. In fact, there are people within my team who know more than 5 years ago were working in retail at shops and have actually broke into cybersecurity because they've shown the passion and aptitude to learn. So if you expect to go out and get 1 million people that are certified up to a specific degree level or a certain industry standard, and then to be able to go out and address the cybersecurity problem, it's never going to work. You've got to think differently. And I don't want to come back with what Steve Jobs says, but effectively you have to think differently. And what that means for me is working with partners. Now, I come from a government background myself, and I'll tell you that there were partners that we used to work with where if there was a major breach, I would make a phone call. So today, for example, while we've been talking, I can tell you APT 31, a major nation state, has been conducting espionage attacks against 9 countries, 9 government entities and public sector entities. And one of those 9 countries is India. So the ability to be able to go out and partner with organizations, the ability to be able to get the global context in order to be able to focus your resources against the things that really matter is going to be crucial. And I completely agree with what's been said earlier, which is working with schools, working with academies, but effectively we do need to start earlier. We do need kids to look and say, hey, you know what? I want a career in cybersecurity. Each and every single one of us should be going out to schools and really inspiring kids to get into this industry, because that to me is where the problem begins. Is most people want to become, well, I would say in India probably want to be cricketers or footballers or actors or actresses, or we're going into accounting and stuff. But effectively, this industry has, for me, the lack of role models for people at a younger age. But look, it's like I said, it's not a skills problem. I've never thought it's a skills problem. It's just a lack of courage to do things slightly differently.
Right. Dr. Pant, we have completely exhausted our time. So last word to you on the skill part, and something very important that Mrs. Samani said about courage, the passion to go after a particular course, a particular thing, and then do it. If you could add something, and then we'll wrap up.
There are 2 hard truths in life. especially in cyber life, that vulnerabilities will continue to exist. And if vulnerabilities continue to exist, then attacks will continue to take place. So if this is the world in which we are going to live in the future, then there is no other action except to create, a resilient cyberspace. So this is what our effort is going to be at the national level, that all the actions that we can take to create a resilient cyberspace, we will be doing, as also, increasing our cyber power index, etc. So this is, it's a marathon without a finish line. I think that is where I will end. Thank you.
With this, now we come to the conclusion of cybersecurity in the age of pandemic. Lieutenant General Pant, Mr. Suresh Sethi, Mr. Amit Sharma, Mr. Jatin Gambhir, Mr. Samani, thank you so much for sharing your views and perspective on changing dynamics of cybersecurity and how public sector organization can mitigate this new emerging trend. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.